we've talked about the why, we've talked about the conversations, maybe some of the hurdles, some of the things you need to watch out for. Now we're saying, what happens when we make it? What happens when we finish the transaction? What happens when we start down the path of actually moving shares, changing our titles, changing our roles? Because there's going to be some things, I think, for all of us that surprise us through that process. But we want to be as best prepared as we can. And there's obviously the element of financial preparedness and knowing that side of things. There's the element of organizational preparedness and doing proper communication with your team, figuring out, hey, what's going to change as far as duties and responsibilities. But I think the best place to start is, what about emotional preparedness? Because there's going to be some things that get stirred up.
Yeah.
What are we going to have to be ready for there? I think first and foremost from the seller side, because that's something you and I have walked with many clients through and have seen a lot of different elements of.
Yeah, well, as you inferred, financial preparedness is what's talked about the most, and it's actually what's the easiest. It's tangible. Yeah, there's some future elements to it that aren't completely tangible, but there's models out there. You guys do great modeling as far as retirement income and things of that nature. That's really the easy part. The emotional preparedness, I'm not quite there yet. I have an element or two of it that is happening right now, but I'm still working full time. I still have relatively significant responsibilities. What I will tell you is, in my experience working with a number of business owners, I believe that one of the greatest impediments to transitions being done in a timely manner in closely held businesses is the lack of a forward-looking plan for the seller. And when I say a plan, what are you moving toward? We would much rather in life, we function much better when we're moving towards something rather than away from something. And, you know, it sounds a little bit like a cliche, but that's been my observation. I had a call, I'm going to call it 4 years ago, from an individual I did not know. I'd been referred to our firm. And we started a conversation, and he was saying, you know, you understand you guys help organizations do transition planning. And he said, I'm starting to think that maybe that's something I should begin to work on. So I started to ask him some questions about his business, and at some point I thought, oh, it'd be interesting to know, you know, where this fellow is in life. I'd not have met him, and this was a phone call, so I didn't have the visual. And so I said, if you don't mind my asking, I said, you said you think sometime here in the near future you should start thinking about transition. I said, how old are you? He said, well, I'm 72. Well, that's actually a too frequent conversation. Now, he was healthy and a good steward of his business. His business was a good business. But that's a little late. And as we had the opportunity to work with that particular business, I really believe that in that particular business person's case, and true of many other situations that we've worked at over the years, that one of his greatest impediments was he could not envision life without himself as the CEO, owner of that particular business. And in some ways, that's kind of sad. Now, it's harder than it sounds. And, you know, I'm about ready to walk down that path for myself. And I do think you referred to it as emotional preparedness. I think that's a large portion of it. And I think also just having something to work toward. And, you know, I think geriatric specialists, social workers would tell us that as long as our life continues to have purpose and meaning, there are a large amount of statistics to show health and longevity are closely associated with purpose and meaning. So if our singular purpose in life has been to be a successful business owner and grow a business, and we're going toward the point where that's not going to be the case anymore, even if that has been an overly singular purpose in our life, we've got to find another one. And that process should start earlier rather than later. And I think it's frequently overlooked.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's really two elements too that I think about. One of them is the practical element. How are you going to spend your time?
Sure.
The 40, 50, 60
Sure.
hours a week you spend working, and the time you spend thinking about your business,
Even more.
and consuming content to be a better leader and to move your business forward. But that's the practical element. Planning out, hey, how am I going to spend the time that used to be filled with something regular and consistent?
Yeah.
The other branch is the part you touched on, and that's our personal identity. How can you run towards a new and really a renewed personal identity that disconnects you from your role in the business? Because like it or not, if you own a business, your identity is tied to it. And for some of us, it's most or not all of our identity. Hopefully for most of us, it's an important piece, but it's a piece. And that's a large piece that I think you need to replace also. And wrapped up in that identity piece, I think you also need to know what the best ramp down is for you, because that's different for all of us. Of course, it's different in different types of businesses. But I recently talked to someone who said, it's just my personality that I'm an all-in, all-out type of person. Said, when I'm ready to sell this thing, it's 100%, and I want to own it one day, own none of it the next day.
Wow.
Be full-time one day, and be done the next day.
That would not work for me.
That would work for a lot of us, but it does work for some.
For some.
And I think it's really important to go on that personal journey and make sure that are you the all-in, all-out type of person? Are you the gradual kind of ramp down type of person, which is probably more of us than not.
So you're saying knowing that about yourself and putting a plan in place that complements that is important?
Absolutely, because if let's say you're a ramp down type of person, that would work best for you. Well, if you get in a situation where you sell your business and one day you own it and the next day you don't, you're going to wake up at some point in the not too distant future and you're probably going to feel an enormous sense of loss.
What did I do?
And grief and maybe some regret. And we want to avoid that, of course, at all costs. So how have you seen some of the folks that you've walked through these situations with, how have you seen them successfully prepare? Because we still got a business to run.
Right.
We still got plenty to do, but we've got to set aside time for this.
Well, you and I, and this would be consistent with our personalities, but we generally believe that an incremental approach is best for most people.
Yeah.
And frankly, if we're talking about honoring the entity, which is a concept we've talked about in some of our previous conversations, for the most part, a gradual letting go of certain types of responsibilities and making sure those responsibilities are being capably picked up by others, even if they're being approached differently by others, is the best thing for the business.
Right.
A lightning bolt is not usually the best thing for a business.
In particular, we're talking about internal succession.
Correct.
I would say particularly with internal succession.
That's exactly right. Now, we're talking about internal. So that's a great clarification, because you sell your business outright to another owner. That's a whole different conversation we can have some other day. But I remember this story. I don't think I'll ever forget this story. It was told to me by a very good business friend of mine. Has a very early business success, and for a variety of reasons, decided to sell his business to a larger entity as an outside sale. And he was probably only in his maybe mid-40s at the time. And he's a very good businessman, a very intense person, I would say. And so it took months to put this deal together and make sure that the key people in his business had secure places in the larger business that he was going to sell to. And he told me this story. He said, we worked for months and months to get this into the right place. And we finally got to the settlement table. Everything was in order. I felt satisfied that I had put everything in place as best as I knew how, that we had negotiated a fair deal. And I signed on to those things, and I walked out the door and I thought, you know what, I did the right thing. And he said, then I went home. He said, I laid down on the sofa and I cried, literally cried for 3 hours. Wow. And this is a friend of mine that probably doesn't cry once a year.
Wow.
But so much of his life, and he's a very intense person, had been plowed into this business. 5 or 6 months, whatever the terminology, the term was that they negotiated this deal, and then it all came out. And I said, well, what happened after you got cried out? He said, I got up and I remembered that I did my very best for that business, that I had a future of things that I was intending to work toward, and I got after the business of working toward my future.
So that
And
future
if I would tell
running
you
too.
who that is, you would
Yeah.
know that that future has been very beneficial to our community and perhaps even the larger community, because this man has invested himself in something that he could work toward. Now, in his case, he was a younger man.
Yeah.
I think we do have to have a different conversation about somebody who is selling at an age where maybe there is a natural slowdown for
Yes.
us. Pick a number, could be 60 or 65, 70, whatever that number is. There are some things, and I'm in that stage, so there are things you start to recognize that maybe you're still a good contributor, but maybe you don't quite have 100% of the energy that you had 10 or 15 years ago. And hopefully you learn to calibrate that. But at some point you have to come to terms with that the next thing that you're working toward, even if there is a next thing, may not be as exciting, may not be as rewarding, may not be as absorbing as what you did in the past. And I think that requires preparation, a reality check, maybe a therapist, maybe a social worker,
Sure.
certainly a lot of good friends, certainly an understanding spouse, and certainly a realistic view of your own self.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think doing that self work, that self-awareness work, is extraordinarily important in this emotional preparedness business. And with some of these owners that we work with that start this process late, I think it's because in a lot of cases they just haven't been willing to invest in that kind of work.
Yeah.
And it's hard work.
It
It's
is
not
hard
fun.
work. It is hard work. And the person who's exiting the business, they're not the only ones who has to deal with some adjustment.
Yes, good point.
We look at the successors as well, and they have some adjustments to make. I know one thing that can be really difficult is imagining them coming in the morning and going over to the person that they're buying the business from, and their office is dark. And their office is empty. And that can actually be a lonely feeling as well when you first buy into the business.
Yeah.
And so I think there's some important elements similar, but in a different way, that a buyer, that generation 2 or 3 or 4, wherever we're at with the business, also needs to prepare for. One of the observations that I've had is when you look at numbers on paper, they're a little different than when you see them on your balance sheet. And of course, we're talking about internal succession, businesses that have value, that are being purchased. There's a transactional element to this. And I remember talking to more than one individual who bought into a business, and they had a time only a few weeks after they bought in where they looked and said, whoa, I've never owed that much money to anybody in my life.
Sure.
Now they could quickly get back to, but I believe in this business. I know the numbers are sound. I believe in our growth. But there's an element there that we have to be ready for too. And part of it is on the duty side. You're a little more on your own. You don't have that guiding hand maybe as much as you did before, but on the financial side as well.
And I think that's a conversation that, particularly if it's founder successor type of thing, like you would be the successor to Charlie and Lyle. In my case, I'm the founder with successors. And I have a little story for you on that, actually. Jerry Murray, my good friend, is just named the president of our firm a few months ago. And so he's been taking on additional responsibilities that were previously mine for the most part. And I think that's going pretty well. But we meet on a regular basis to make sure, primarily, certainly to honor the entity and our various responsibilities. But one of the main parts of the conversations is, are we supporting each other in the right way? So we were coming back from lunch and we had covered most of the topics that we had planned to cover. And I was like, hey, this would be a good time to just check and see, is there something that he or the firm needs from me that they're not quite getting? And so I asked that question. I said, Jerry, what would you ask me to do differently? And he thought a minute. Well, actually didn't think very long at all. It must have been on his mind. And he said, he said, he's a very nice way of putting things, as you know. But he said, well, I know you were on vacation 2 weeks ago, and I know you have a lot of external responsibilities with nonprofits and business development and your golf exploits and all this kind of thing. He says, but we can't lose your voice from the office. And I said, well, tell me what you mean. He said, just your personality, your way of stirring up some humor in the office, of engaging with their employees. We don't have a way to replace that. Now, I took that as a challenge, but also as a compliment. Absolutely. And I thought, you know what? I think I understand what he's saying. And I think it was a way for him to express that there's an intangible ethic there,
yes,
that I represent. It's not that it can't be replaced. It will be over time. But right now, it's an important transitional element. And again, the trust of our relationships allowed him to express that without me receiving it as anything other than good advice and a reasonable ask that I think I'm capable of fulfilling. But it's going to be much more top of mind for me going forward. And I admit, hadn't been particularly top of mind for me for the last few months.
And ultimately,
I was happy to receive that advice.
Yeah, and ultimately you're willing to do that because that's what's best for the entity. And
and it's not hard, but maybe I was thinking that I needed to stay out of the way a little bit more. And I do want to stay out of the way of the things that are beneficial for me to stay out of the way of.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a really difficult balance to strike for both sides of the equation. I know
Which is why you have to be... You have
to have that open conversation. Yes. Absolutely. Because I know one of the things for me early on is I was maybe a little nervous to really insert my voice into certain conversations.
Right.
And again, a foundation of trust and some conversation of you're in. This is what we're asking you to do. Do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's not uncommon at all, especially if you're in the room together, especially when you're with your team. And another element of that I think is really interesting to think about goes back to something we talked about earlier, and that's the difference between starting something from scratch and in some ways being on your own and buying into something that's existing, where you already have the comfort level when you've bought in of what's around you. So your personality is naturally more bent towards, I've got this team, I've got this thing that has an engine going, rather than starting a business from scratch and saying, it's all on me. I got to get this going. I'm coming in, I'm turning the lights on, I'm taking the trash out, I'm doing all the difficult things. That's a different dynamic. I think that's something that needs to be on the table at all times of, that's a personality difference. We've got to make sure we're meeting in the middle on those things.
Yeah, and there's often significant differences between the style and input of a founder / entrepreneur and that of a person who is skilled at managed growth.
Absolutely.
And how do we make those complementary rather than competitive? And that takes work, that takes communication, that takes trust. The foundational elements we've been talking about throughout this series, really.
Yeah.
One other thing I wanted to point out was that and I'm working toward this, is that the transition out for a founder or for a next generation owner who's moving toward another season of life is that there are people outside the business that are going to be significantly affected by that change. The first person, obviously, you think of is if there's a spouse involved. In my case, there is. Have significant conversation with that person about what that adjustment's going to look like, and really about what expectations are going to look like.
Yeah, because they're not used to you being there all the time.
Right.
You don't want to drive them crazy.
Or just introducing a certain amount of flexibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I haven't utilized most of that flexibility in my life. It's Monday, it's Friday. I'm going to be gone from 6:30 in the morning to 6 o'clock at night. And for Carolyn, that's fine. She's okay with that. She likes that. She likes me to be gone, but I mean, she likes the certainty of knowing there's a schedule there. We both work well with that. When that's not there anymore, it's not fair for me to think, hey, now I've got a certain amount of flexibility. I'm around more. She should adjust to that. Let's have a conversation about that. Let's have a conversation about all the things that will be different. And if we need someone else to help us get through that, and that's one thing that I've been starting down the path of doing is I've been taking advantage of conversations with people who are a step or two ahead of me in terms of transition and saying, tell me what it looks like for you now. How do you use your time? What are you doing on a rainy Tuesday afternoon at 2:30?
Yeah.
Because I fear rainy afternoons at 2:30 because you can only sweep the garage so many times.
That's right. That's right.
Once it's clean, what am I going to do? And I don't want to be a pain in the neck to somebody. I don't want to get in the way of Carolyn's schedule and the things that she wants to do. I want to be useful, but I also don't want to overplay my hand. And I think that takes a good amount of thought, of prayer, of preparation, of advice, of learning from people who've gone before us and done it well.
Yeah, I think that advice of who's been there, who's done it, who's a step ahead of you is key. And I think that exists again on the side of someone entering into the business, because that's going to change some elements. It certainly changes the financial picture. There's a new level of financial pressure. Of course, there's upside to that, and hopefully we realize that upside, but that's new. That might put a different sense of, hey, how are we managing our family finances? There's a new pressure of just stress, of overall being responsible for more than just my job. I'm now responsible for my entire team, all of my clients and customers. That adds an element of responsibility and weight that may come up more in the family conversations or in the conversations with your spouse than it did before when you had a specific job to do. And so I think it's as well important to integrate everyone in your circle, both in the business and outside of the business, into those conversations. And as you said, make sure you're all prepared for that. So as we've gone through this series, you and I like to wrap things up, try to put a fine point on things. One thing that we talked a lot about is your why and the foundational elements of going down this path of internal succession. And so I think we'd both say, define your why, get those foundational elements in place of trust, honoring the entity, and transparency, and getting things on the table when they need to be. How would you wrap it up on top of that why?
I mean, I think building relationships of trust early on and letting them percolate to the pinnacle of when the deal gets done, and then we have behavior after the deal. And I think right now, both of us are benefiting from the fact that we've been part of trust-building relationships with trustworthy people that have really greased the gears, so to speak, to help these transitions work better. The other thing I said, don't be afraid to bring in good outside advice. There are other people that have either experienced these types of things or experienced them through others because they are professional advisors. They're worth their fees. You, me, and others are worth their fees to help you walk through this in a way that's intentional and God-honoring, and will allow us to achieve the legacy that we set out to achieve.
Yeah, I think ultimately all those things set us up for win, win, win.
Right.
A win for the successor, a win for the successee.
And ultimately a win for the entity.
Ultimately a win for the entity.
Yeah.
Thanks,
you.
Dad.